We've all had those nights where something feels just off. You can't put your finger on it, but there's a weight in the air, a quiet tension that makes the walls feel closer than they should. That's what my nights started to feel like, but back then, I didn't know why. Not yet. My name's Caleb, and I've lived in Ashland, Kentucky, my whole life. Quiet town, quieter people, mostly coal and steel families like mine. My wife, Laura, and I had been married for 17 years. We weren't what you'd call a passionate couple anymore, but it was a solid marriage, you know? Or at least I thought so. We had our routines, her weekly book club, my Friday poker nights, and Sunday mornings at the diner downtown. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Or again, so I thought. Things changed gradually, almost too slowly to notice at first. It started with my sleep. I've always been a light sleeper, the kind who tosses and turns, so when I began waking up groggy and disoriented, I figured it was just age catching up to me. 40 sneaks up on you like that. But this was different. I'd wake up feeling like I hadn't slept at all, like someone had pressed pause on my brain. And I'd notice things, little things that didn't make sense. My phone wouldn't be where I left it, or the living room lights would be on even though Laura always turned them off. You need to stop stressing about work, Laura would say, sliding a cup of coffee my way. She'd smile at me, her brown eyes warm and steady like always, but there was something else there too, like she was waiting for me to agree, to just let it go. So I did. Until the headaches started. They came on sharp and fast, like a knife between my eyes. I thought maybe it was my blood pressure, or all the late nights in front of the TV, but deep down, it felt like something worse. I made an appointment for you with Dr. Hayward, Laura said one night as we sat on the porch. It was spring, and the air smelled like the honeysuckle that grew along the fence. She squeezed my hand. I'm worried about you, Cal. She was good at that, being concerned without overdoing it. It made me feel like I was just imagining things, like I was overreacting. So I nodded and let her schedule the checkup, even though a part of me hated going to doctors. The appointment came and went without much fanfare. Dr. Hayward ran some basic tests, and chalked it up to stress and poor sleep hygiene. Cut back on caffeine, no screens before bed, and maybe try melatonin, he said, writing something down on a clipboard. That night, Laura handed me a small white pill. It's just melatonin, she said, sitting beside me on the couch. Her smile was reassuring, like it always was. Take it. It'll help. And for a while it did. I don't know when exactly I started noticing the gaps. It wasn't like I woke up one day and realized I'd been losing time. It was more subtle than that, like coming into the kitchen and finding a half-eaten plate of food I didn't remember making. Or overhearing Laura mention something I swore we hadn't talked about. You're working too hard, she'd say when I brought it up. It's not good for you, Cal. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But then came that Friday night. Laura had invited a few friends over, nothing unusual there. We had a tight-knit group that went way back. Mostly couples like us, people we'd known since high school. Except this time, it wasn't the whole group. Just Laura, me, and Mark. Mark had been my best friend for years. We played on the same Little League team, worked the same summer job at the gas station, and even double-dated back in the day. He was practically family. Just a casual hangout, Laura had said earlier that week, brushing her blonde hair out of her face as she folded laundry. It'll be nice to catch up. I didn't think much of it at the time. But that night something felt off. Mark showed up with a bottle of bourbon, his grin easy and familiar. We laughed, swapped old stories, and played cards. Laura flitted between us, pouring drinks and laughing at all the right moments. It was the kind of night we'd had 100 times before. But somewhere around 10 o'clock, my memory goes blank. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, my glass half full, and then, nothing. Just darkness. When I woke up the next morning, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Laura was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she made pancakes. She smiled when she saw me, but her eyes flickered, just for a second, like she was waiting for something. "You must have been exhausted," she said, setting a plate in front of me. "You went out like a light." I nodded, forcing a smile, but my chest felt tight. Something wasn't right. Later that day, I found Mark's hat on the back porch. "Mark leave this behind?" I asked, holding it up. Laura barely glanced at it. "Oh, yeah? He must have forgotten it." Her tone was so casual, so unconcerned, that I almost believed her. Almost. Over the next few weeks, the blank spots became harder to ignore. I started keeping a journal, jotting down notes about my day before bed. What I ate, who I saw, what we talked about. It was tedious, but it helped, until it didn't. Because no matter how detailed my notes were, there were still holes. And then, one night, I found a piece of paper tucked under the couch cushion. It was small and crumpled, with just 3 words scrawled on it in Laura's handwriting. "Not yet, soon." It didn't make any sense. But deep down, I knew it was a breadcrumb, a clue leading to something I wasn't sure I wanted to find. That's when I decided to stop taking the pills. And that's when everything began to unravel. To be continued. Let me know when you're ready for part 2. Go. ChatGPT. Part 2. The curtain starts to lift. The night I stopped taking the pills, I pretended like everything was normal. Laura handed me the tiny white tablet like she always did, her smile as steady as ever. I cupped it in my hand, pretending to swallow, then slipped it into my pocket while she wasn't looking. "Feeling any better?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Yeah, I think the worst of it's behind me," I said, keeping my voice even. She leaned in, kissed my cheek, and headed upstairs to bed. I sat in the living room for a while, listening to the house settle into its usual nighttime quiet. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the floorboards, it all felt too familiar, like a lullaby designed to keep me complacent. But not tonight. Tonight, I was going to stay awake. At first, nothing happened. I sat in the recliner, sipping water and flipping channels on the TV, but my mind was on high alert. Midnight came and went, and everything was still. By 1:30, I started to feel ridiculous. Maybe this really was all in my head. Maybe Laura was right, and I just needed rest. Then I heard it, the faint shuffle of footsteps coming down the stairs. I froze, straining to listen. "Laura?" I called out, my voice low but steady. No answer. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. But then I saw her, just a shadow moving through the kitchen, the faint glow of the moonlight catching her outline. She was wearing the same robe she always did, but the way she moved was different. Purposeful. Secretive. I stayed still, watching as she opened one of the kitchen drawers and pulled something out. A small vial, maybe the size of my thumb. She turned it over in her hands, her expression unreadable, then slipped it into her pocket. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but something held me back. Instead, I waited until she went back upstairs before I crept into the kitchen. The drawer she'd opened was empty. The next morning, I acted like nothing had happened. Laura was her usual self, cheerful, attentive, and just distant enough to make me question everything. "Mark called," she said over breakfast. "He wants to know if you're up for poker night this Friday." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Sure. It'll be good to catch up." But as the week went on, I couldn't shake the image of her standing in the kitchen, holding that vial. What was in it? Why had she hidden it? I started going through her things when she wasn't home. It felt wrong, like I was violating some unspoken rule of marriage, but the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. I checked her purse, her nightstand, even her car. Nothing. Then, one afternoon, I found a second piece of paper. It was tucked inside her planner, sandwiched between a grocery list and a reminder about the vet appointment for our dog, Milo. This one had more words, but they were no less cryptic. "Friday is perfect. Same plan as before." Friday came faster than I expected. Mark showed up just after 7, carrying his usual 6-pack of beer and wearing that easy grin of his. "How's life treating you, buddy?" he asked, clapping me on the back. Can't complain, I said, though my stomach was in knots. Laura moved around us like a hostess at a party, laughing at Mark's jokes and refilling our drinks. By the time we sat down to play cards, it felt like any other Friday night. But I was ready this time. I nursed my drink, pretending to sip but never actually swallowing. Laura didn't seem to notice, too busy pouring bourbon for Mark and herself. By the time 10 o'clock rolled around, I could feel my eyelids getting heavy. It wasn't exhaustion, it was whatever she'd been giving me all those nights before. I forced myself to stay alert, focusing on the hum of the ceiling fan, the clink of ice in Mark's glass, the sound of Laura's laugh. Gotta hit the bathroom, I said, standing up. Don't fall in, Mark joked, his voice warm and familiar. I stepped out of the room but didn't head to the bathroom. Instead, I slipped into a hallway and crouched by the doorframe, peeking into the living room. What I saw made my blood run cold. Laura was leaning close to Mark, her hand resting on his arm. She was smiling, but it wasn't her usual smile. It was something else. Mark glanced toward the hallway, and I ducked out of sight. My heart was pounding, but I stayed quiet, listening as their voices dropped to a murmur. You sure about this? Mark asked. Laura's response was too quiet to hear, but whatever she said made him laugh. I stayed in the hallway, waiting for them to say something that would give me a clearer picture. But after a few minutes, the conversation shifted back to small talk, and I felt like I was going insane. By the time I returned to the living room, they were sitting apart again, the atmosphere light and casual. Ready to lose the rest of your chips? Mark teased, dealing me back in. I forced a laugh, but my mind was elsewhere. After Mark left that night, I confronted Laura. What was that about? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She looked genuinely confused. What are you talking about? Your little chat with Mark when you thought I wasn't around. Her expression softened, like she was dealing with a child throwing a tantrum. Caleb, you're tired. You're not thinking straight. I know what I saw, Laura. Her eyes narrowed, just for a second, before she sighed and walked away. Maybe you should take one of your pills, she called over her shoulder. The way she said it sent a chill down my spine. To be continued. Let me know when you're ready for part 3. Go. ChatGPT. Part 3. The shroud begins to lift. The house was silent after Laura went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch, staring at the faint outline of my reflection in the dark TV screen. Her words kept echoing in my head. Maybe you should take one of your pills. It wasn't just the suggestion that rattled me. It was the way she said it, casual and dismissive, like I wasn't even a factor in my own life anymore. I needed answers. At around 2 a.m., I slipped out of bed and into the kitchen. The pills were in the cabinet above the sink, tucked into the back like an afterthought. I pulled the bottle down and turned it over in my hand, squinting at the label in the dim light. It was exactly what she said it was, melatonin. But something felt off. I grabbed my phone and snapped a picture of the label, then opened the bottle and spilled the pills out onto the counter. They were all identical, small, white, and unmarked. No brand name, no imprint. Nothing. A quick Google search confirmed what I was starting to suspect. Real melatonin pills should have some kind of identifier on them. These didn't. My hand shook as I swept the pills back into the bottle. I needed to know what I'd been taking, but I wasn't about to confront Laura without proof. The next day, I drove into town and stopped at a pharmacy. I told the pharmacist I'd found some old pills in my cabinet and wasn't sure what they were. She gave me a skeptical look but agreed to take a look. Give me a few minutes, she said, disappearing into the back. When she returned, her expression was tight. These aren't melatonin, she said, lowering her voice. They're a sedative, zolpidem. Prescription only. Who gave you these? My stomach churned. I thought they were melatonin, I muttered, barely able to get the words out. Well, they're not, she said firmly. And you shouldn't be taking them without a prescription. You could seriously mess yourself up. I thanked her and left, my mind racing. Laura had been drugging me. That night, I couldn't bring myself to act like everything was fine. Laura noticed. "Rough day?" she asked, sliding into the seat across from me at the dinner table. "Yeah," I said shortly, keeping my eyes on my plate. She tilted her head, studying me. "You've been quiet lately. I guess I've had a lot on my mind." Her smile faltered, just for a second. "Anything I can help with?" I wanted to scream at her, demand an explanation, but I knew better. If she'd been lying to me this whole time, she'd lie again. No, I needed to be smart about this. "Not really," I said, forcing a smile. "Just work stuff." She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. That Friday, Mark came over again. I was tempted to cancel, but I needed to see them together. I needed to watch them, to catch something that would confirm what I already feared. The night started out normal enough. We played cards, drank bourbon, and swapped stories about the old days. Laura hovered nearby, refilling drinks and laughing at all the right moments. But as the night wore on, I started noticing things. The way Laura's eyes lingered on Mark a little too long. The way his hand brushed hers when she handed him a glass. It wasn't overt, nothing you'd call out in the moment, but it was there, subtle and insidious. Around 11, I pretended to get up for a bathroom break again. This time, I grabbed my phone and hit record before slipping into the hallway. They didn't say much at first, just small talk about work and mutual friends. But then Laura lowered her voice. "You're sure about this?" she asked, her tone urgent. Mark hesitated. "Yeah, but what if he figures it out?" "He won't," she said quickly. "He hasn't yet, has he?" My heart pounded in my chest. Mark sighed. "I don't know, Laura. This feels risky." "Just stick to the plan," she said, her voice firm. "We're too far in to back out now." I wanted to storm in, demand answers, but my body wouldn't move. I stayed rooted to the spot, my phone trembling in my hand. When Mark finally left, Laura came upstairs to find me lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She climbed into bed beside me and turned out the light. "You've been so distant lately," she murmured. "I miss you." I wanted to scream at her, to demand she tell me the truth, but instead I just lay there, staring into the darkness. Whatever she and Mark were planning, it wasn't over. And if I wanted to get to the bottom of it, I'd have to play along a little while longer. To be continued. Let me know when you're ready for Part 4. Go. ChatGPT. Part 4. Threads begin to fray. The days after that Friday night were some of the hardest I've ever lived through. Every glance from Laura felt like a challenge, every casual touch felt like a test. I knew she was hiding something, knew she was working with Mark on whatever this was. But until I had real proof, I couldn't let her know I was onto her. So I started digging. First, I reviewed the recording on my phone. I listened to it over and over again, hoping to catch something I'd missed in the moment. Laura's words were crystal clear. Stick to the plan. But what plan? What were they waiting for? The vagueness of it drove me insane. Next, I went through her phone. It wasn't easy. Laura was careful with her passwords and even more careful about where she left her devices. But one evening, while she was showering, I managed to unlock it. Most of her texts were mundane. Chats with friends about book club, a thread with her sister about some upcoming family event. But buried in the middle of her messages was a conversation with Mark. It was brief, just a few lines, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. "Mark, everything's set for next week." Laura, "Good. Same as before, right?" Mark, "Yeah. Don't worry, it'll go smooth." I stared at the screen until the words blurred together. Next week? What was happening next week? The sound of the shower turning off jolted me back to reality. I quickly locked her phone and put it back where I'd found it, my heart racing. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Laura's steady breathing beside me only made the knot in my chest tighten. I needed to know what they were planning. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day driving around town, trying to piece together what little I knew. I stopped by Mark's place first, parking a few houses down and watching from a distance. His truck was in the driveway, but the house looked quiet. I waited for an hour before giving up. Next, I went to Laura's favorite coffee shop. She wasn't there, but I spotted one of her book club friends, Jenny, sitting by the window. "Hey, Caleb," she said brightly when she saw me. "What brings you here?" "Just grabbing a coffee," I lied. "How's it going?" We chatted for a few minutes, small talk about the weather and local gossip, before I casually steered the conversation toward Laura. "She's been busy lately, huh?" I said, forcing a laugh. Jenny frowned. "Not really. She's been skipping book club the last couple of weeks." "Said she's been tired?" My stomach dropped. "Tired, huh?" I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Guess I've been working her too hard around the house." Jenny laughed, but the unease in my chest only grew. When I got home, I found Laura in the backyard, trimming the hedges. She looked up and smiled when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're home early," she said, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Yeah," I said, leaning against the porch railing. "Work was slow." She nodded, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "How about we have a quiet night in?" I suggested. "Just the two of us." She hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Sure. That sounds nice." But it wasn't nice. Not really. We ate dinner in near silence, the TV droning on in the background as we avoided each other's eyes. Every bite felt heavy, every glance felt like a landmine waiting to go off. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "I ran into Jenny today," I said casually, cutting into my steak. Laura froze for a fraction of a second before forcing a smile. "Oh? How is she? She mentioned you haven't been to book club lately." Laura's knife slipped, clattering against her plate. "Yeah," she said quickly, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "I've just been so busy with everything." "Busy with what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She looked up at me, her eyes narrowing. "Why are you interrogating me?" "I'm not," I said, trying to backpedal. I worry about you, that's all." "Well, don't," she snapped, standing up and grabbing her plate. "I'm fine." I watched as she stormed into the kitchen, the knot in my chest tightening. That night, I decided to take things a step further. While Laura slept, I crept downstairs and went through her purse again. This time, I found something new, a small receipt, crumpled and shoved into the side pocket. It was from a hotel in Lexington, dated 3 weeks ago. The receipt listed a single night's stay for 2 people. I stared at it, my hands shaking. Lexington was an hour away. Laura had never mentioned going there. I wanted to wake her up and demand an explanation, but I knew it would be pointless. She'd deny it, twist the truth, and I'd be back where I started. No, I needed to wait. The next few days passed in a blur. I went to work, came home, and played the part of the oblivious husband. But inside, I was unraveling. By the time Friday rolled around, I felt like a live wire, buzzing with tension. Mark showed up around 7, as usual. He was his normal self, relaxed, easygoing, and just a little too comfortable in my house. Laura, on the other hand, seemed on edge. She laughed too loudly at Mark's jokes, her eyes darting toward me whenever she thought I wasn't looking. I couldn't take it anymore. Around 10 o'clock, I stood up and stretched. "Think I'm gonna call it a night," I said, forcing a yawn. Laura looked surprised. "Already?" "Yeah," I said, rubbing the back of my neck. "Long week." Mark chuckled. "Lightweight." I laughed along with him, but my heart was pounding. I headed upstairs and closed the bedroom door behind me, then waited. At first, nothing happened. I lay there in the dark, my ears straining for any sound. Then I heard it, the soft murmur of voices downstairs. I crept to the top of the stairs, moving as quietly as I could. From my vantage point, I could see them in the living room. Laura was sitting on the couch, leaning close to Mark, her hand resting on his knee. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. To be continued. Let me know when you're ready for part 5. Go. ChatGPT. Part 5. The cracks deepen. I froze at the top of the stairs, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they'd hear it. Laura and Mark were sitting on the couch, leaning closer than two old friends ever should. Her hand lingered on his knee, her expression unreadable in the dim light. I wanted to storm down there and demand answers, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my body stuck between fury and fear. Instead, I stayed rooted to the spot, watching as they whispered to each other like conspirators. "Are you sure he's out?" Mark asked, his voice low. Laura glanced toward the stairs, her face tense. "He's asleep," she said, though there was an edge of uncertainty in her voice. "He's been exhausted lately." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This is getting risky, Laura. He's bound to notice something." "He won't," she said firmly. "We've come too far to back out now." I gripped the railing, my knuckles turning white. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. What had they come too far with? What were they hiding? "Next week," Mark said, leaning closer. "That's it. After that, we're done." Laura nodded, her face set in determination. "Next week." I couldn't take it anymore. I crept back to the bedroom, my mind racing. Whatever was happening, it was coming to a head next week. And I wasn't about to sit around and wait for it to blow up in my face. The next morning, I acted like nothing had happened. "Mark stayed late last night," I said casually over breakfast. "What were you two talking about?" Laura didn't miss a beat. "Oh, just catching up," she said, sipping her coffee. "He's been having a tough time at work." "Must have been some conversation," I said, keeping my tone light. She gave me a small smile. "You know how Mark is. Once he gets going, he doesn't stop." I nodded, but her words only solidified my suspicions. That afternoon, I decided to do something I'd never done before: follow her. Laura had mentioned running errands, so I waited until she left the house, then trailed her car from a safe distance. My heart raced as I tailed her through the quiet streets of Ashland, out onto the highway, and into the next town over. She pulled into the parking lot of a small motel, the kind of place where no one asked questions. I parked a block away and watched as she got out of the car, her posture tense. She glanced around before heading inside, her purse clutched tightly to her side. I waited for 10 minutes, then 20, my palms sweating as I gripped the steering wheel. Finally, she emerged, her expression calm but her pace quick. I followed her back home, my mind reeling. What had she been doing there? Meeting someone? Dropping something off? When she walked through the door, I was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to look as casual as possible. "How were the errands?" I asked, forcing a smile. She hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering. "Fine. Just picked up a few things." I nodded, but my chest felt tight. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her and Mark on the couch, whispering. I saw her walking into that motel, her eyes darting around like she was afraid of being seen. By the time the sun came up, I'd made a decision. I was going to find out the truth, no matter what it took. Over the next few days, I started preparing. I installed a small recording device in the living room, hidden behind a stack of books on the shelf. I set up a motion-activated camera in the kitchen, disguised as an air freshener. And I kept watching. Laura didn't act any differently, which only made me more suspicious. She smiled at me, kissed me goodnight, and went about her day like everything was normal. But I knew better. On Wednesday, I got my first piece of real evidence. The camera in the kitchen caught Laura on the phone with Mark. Her voice was hushed, but the recording was clear. "It's all set," she said. "I've got everything ready. Friday night, same time?" I clenched my fists as I listened, my blood boiling. Friday night. Whatever they were planning, it was happening then. When Friday finally came, I felt like I was walking a tightrope over a pit of fire. Laura was calm, cheerful even, as she set out snacks and cleaned the living room. Mark showed up right on time, carrying a bottle of wine and flashing his usual grin. "Ready to lose again?" he joked, clapping me on the back. I forced a laugh, my stomach churning. We played cards, drank, and laughed like nothing was wrong. But every glance between Laura and Mark felt like a dagger. Around 10, I pretended to get tired again. "Think I'm gonna turn in," I said, stretching. Laura gave me a quick smile. "Sleep well." Mark smirked. "Lightweight." I nodded and headed upstairs, but instead of going to bed, I waited at the top of the stairs, just out of sight. This time, I wasn't leaving anything to chance. To be continued. Let me know when you're ready for Part 6. Go. ChatGPT. Part 6, Beneath the Surface. I crouched at the top of the stairs, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might give me away. Down below, their voices were low but unmistakable. Laura and Mark were talking again, their tones hushed, as if the walls themselves might betray them. "You're sure?" Mark said, his voice laced with tension. "Yes," Laura replied, her tone resolute. "We've gone over this 100 times, Mark. It'll work." "And Caleb?" he asked, lowering his voice even further. "What if he wakes up?" "He won't," Laura said confidently. "He's out like a light by now. Trust me." The sound of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. They'd been relying on me being drugged all along. Whatever they were planning, it revolved around me staying unconscious. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as I fought the urge to burst down there and confront them. I had to know more. For what felt like an eternity, they continued their conversation. Most of it was vague, filled with half-finished sentences and cryptic remarks. It was clear they were careful, even in private. But then Mark said something that froze me in place. "So, next week it's done," he said, almost a question. Laura didn't hesitate. "Yes. Once the papers are signed, it's over. He'll never know what hit him." My chest tightened, the words echoing in my head, "The papers are signed." What papers? What were they planning? After Mark left that night, I crept back into bed, feigning sleep when Laura slipped under the covers beside me. I lay there in the dark, my mind racing. They were planning something big, something involving me. But I still didn't have enough to confront her, or to go to anyone else. I needed more. The next morning, Laura acted as if nothing had happened. She hummed to herself as she made coffee, kissed me on the cheek, and asked about my plans for the day. "Not much," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Probably just some yard work." "Sounds good," she said with a smile. "I'm meeting Jenny for lunch, so I'll be out for a bit." I nodded, watching her closely. She seemed completely at ease, but that only made me more suspicious. As soon as she left, I grabbed the recording device from the living room and listened to the audio from the night before. Most of their conversation matched what I'd overheard, but there were a few extra details I'd missed in real time. "Once the papers are signed, the money's ours," Mark had said at one point. "Money? What money?" I decided to do something drastic. I called in sick to work again and drove into town, heading straight for the bank. "Hi, I need to check on my accounts," I told the teller, trying to sound casual. "Sure," she said, typing something into her computer. "Which account?" "All of them," I said quickly. She frowned, glancing at her screen. "It looks like everything's in order," she said after a moment. "Nothing unusual." I nodded, relieved but still uneasy. "Thanks. Can I get printouts of all recent transactions?" "Of course." She handed me a stack of papers, and I scanned them as I walked back to my car. At first, nothing stood out. Bills, grocery purchases, the usual. But then I saw it, a large withdrawal from our joint account, made 2 weeks ago. I hadn't made it. That night, I confronted Laura. "Hey," I said, holding up the bank statement. "What's this withdrawal for?" She glanced at the paper and smiled. "Oh, that? I used it to pay off the credit card. Remember? We talked about it." I didn't remember any such conversation, but I nodded anyway, not wanting to tip my hand. "Right. I said, forcing a smile. Just making sure. Her eyes lingered on mine for a moment, and I could feel her trying to gauge whether I believed her. The next few days were a blur of tension and second-guessing. Laura continued to act like everything was normal, but I knew better. On Thursday, I decided to search her car. She'd left for her morning yoga class, giving me a solid hour to snoop. At first, I didn't find much, just the usual clutter of receipts, gum wrappers, and reusable shopping bags. But then I opened the glove compartment. Inside was a manila envelope, thick and heavy. I pulled it out, my hands shaking, and opened it. Inside were several documents. The first was a life insurance policy, my life insurance policy. The second was a handwritten letter and signed that read, "To whom it may concern, I deeply regret what I've done. The pressure was too much, and I couldn't see any other way out. Please know this wasn't anyone's fault but my own." My blood turned to ice. I shoved the envelope back into the glove compartment and slammed it shut, my chest heaving. She was planning something, all right. Something that involved my life insurance, a fake suicide note, and, if I didn't stop her, my death. I sat in the car for a long time, my mind racing. I needed a plan. That night, I acted like nothing was wrong. Laura smiled at me over dinner, her eyes warm and familiar. But I saw her differently now. She wasn't just my wife anymore. She was my enemy. To be continued. Let me know when you're ready for Part 7. Go. ChatGPT. Part 7, The Plan Unfolds. I couldn't look at Laura without seeing the envelope in her glove compartment. Every smile she gave me felt like a mask, every touch like a calculated move. She thought she had me fooled, thought I was just stumbling through life oblivious to what was happening under my nose. But I wasn't oblivious anymore. I spent Friday morning setting up the last of my safeguards. The recording device in the living room had been helpful, but I needed something more. I installed a second hidden camera in the bedroom, angled to catch the entire room. If they were going to try something, I'd have proof. That evening, Laura was unusually affectionate. She made my favorite dinner, fried chicken and mashed potatoes, then suggested we open a bottle of wine to celebrate the end of a long week. "Here's to us," she said, raising her glass. "To us," I echoed, forcing a smile. The wine tasted bitter, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just my imagination. I pretended to drink, tilting the glass to my lips without letting the liquid touch my tongue. By the time we finished dinner, I was more on edge than ever. Laura cleared the plates with a contented smile, humming to herself as she rinsed them in the sink. "You heading to bed soon?" she asked casually. "Yeah, probably," I said, feigning a yawn. "It's been a long week." She smiled, and for a split second, I saw something in her eyes, relief, maybe. Satisfaction. I went upstairs and waited. This time, I didn't bother pretending to sleep. I sat in the corner of the room, just out of sight of the door, the camera's red light blinking faintly in the dark. For an hour, nothing happened. I could hear Laura moving around downstairs, her footsteps steady and unhurried. But then, just after midnight, the creak of the stairs broke the silence. I held my breath as the door eased open. Laura stepped into the room, her movements slow and deliberate. She was holding something small in her hand, but I couldn't see what it was in the dim light. "Caleb?" she whispered, her voice soft. I didn't respond. She moved closer, her hand hovering over my side of the bed. That's when I saw it, a small syringe, glinting faintly in the darkness. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay still. I needed to see what she was going to do. Laura hesitated, her hand trembling slightly. Then she leaned over the bed and whispered, "I'm sorry." It was the last thing I needed to hear. I lunged forward, grabbing her wrist before she could react. The syringe fell to the floor, and her gasp filled the room. "Caleb!" she stammered, trying to pull away. "What are you doing awake? What the hell are you doing?" I demanded, my voice shaking with fury. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape. I thought you were having trouble sleeping." It's just a sedative. Don't lie to me, I roared, tightening my grip on her wrist. She flinched, her facade cracking for the first time. Caleb, please let me explain. Explain what? I snapped. The life insurance? The fake suicide note? The plan you and Mark have been cooking up behind my back? Her face went pale, and for a moment she didn't say anything. Then she whispered, It's not what you think. I let go of her wrist, stepping back. Then tell me, I said coldly. What the hell is going on? She sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands trembling in her lap. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she murmured. It was Mark's idea. He said we could make it look like an accident. I stared at her, my chest tight with anger and disbelief. Make what look like an accident? She looked up at me, her eyes glistening with tears. Your death, she said, her voice barely audible. My stomach turned, and I had to steady myself against the wall. You were going to kill me, I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. It wasn't supposed to go this far, she cried. Mark said it would be quick, that you wouldn't feel anything. We'd split the money and I thought. You thought what? I snapped. That you'd get away with it? That I wouldn't figure it out? Tears streamed down her face, but I felt no sympathy. She had planned this. She had lied to me, drugged me, and conspired to take everything I had, including my life. I want you out, I said, my voice cold and steady. Tonight. Caleb, please. No, I barked. You don't get to beg for forgiveness. You don't get to explain this away. Get out of my house before I call the cops. She stared at me for a long moment, her expression shifting from desperation to something darker. You'll regret this, she said quietly, her voice hard. Not as much as you will, I replied. She left that night, taking only her purse and the clothes on her back. I sat in the living room until sunrise, the weight of everything crashing down on me. By the time I called the police, I had my story straight. The recording from the bedroom camera was enough to corroborate my account, and the fake suicide note in her glove compartment sealed the deal. Mark was arrested 2 days later, and Laura turned herself in shortly after. The case made headlines across Kentucky, but I didn't care about the media frenzy. I cared about surviving, about piecing my life back together after the betrayal of the person I'd trusted most.